Hello, and welcome to this week's lecture. I hope you had a nice break from classes. While I realize you were probably still working and battling the weather, at least you had a week off from listening to me. So this week we're going to talk about speculative fiction, which is a term that encompasses both science fiction and fantasy. And the speculative part of it comes from the fact that it's speculating on things that actually don't occur in the real world. So as opposed to the definition we discussed for realistic fiction, something that could happen, science fiction and fantasy involve things that maybe could happen, but are not within what we consider actually occurring events in the real world. So fantasy often involves magic and other kind of fantastical elements. Science fiction is projecting into the future what could happen, usually in terms of technology. So there are people, places, or events that, as we understand the world right now, could not happen. Think about dragons that fly, or warp speed like in Star Trek, or hyperspeed, whatever they call it in Star Wars, or anything like that. People, places, or events that couldn't occur as we know the real world now. One of the aspects of speculative fiction is the idea of world building. And because we're not within the realm of realism, you have to, the author builds a world that makes sense within the rules that they set down for the world. So if you have, as in, say, Harry Potter, it has certain rules. There's magic within Harry Potter, and there's certain things they can do and certain things they can't do. And you need to be consistent within the rules of the world in order for it to make sense. If you've decided that a wand and a incantation are what you need in order to do magic, then it doesn't make sense that thinking the magic works within the rules of the world, that just telepathy or something like that would work within the rules that were set out by J.K. Rowling in Harry Potter. There were certain specific rules that she engaged in for the world. They weren't supposed to see what was happening. The muggles, people without magic, were not supposed to know that there was magic in the world. And so they tried to stay within those rules. And of course, there's crossover, and that's where you get the conflict and the plot in some cases. So the big question at the center of speculative fiction is always, what if? What if there was a school like Hogwarts, a school that trained magicians in the world? What if in the future we have a series of spaceships like in Star Trek that go out and explore, bravely go where no person has gone before. No one has gone before, as they say now. They used to say where no man has gone before. I think it's no one. So it's the idea of what can we imagine that would happen, which makes it, the what if question can still happen within realistic fiction. What if these two people meet and this happens? But it's expanded within science fiction and fantasy. The what if goes farther. It goes beyond what actually can happen and goes to what could possibly happen if things were different. The difference between fantasy and science fiction is that fantasy is often evocative. It evokes a magical feeling, and it evokes an idea of a world without any hard scientific fact underneath of it. Whereas science fiction extrapolates from what we know now and looks at what our technology and what could be in the future based on what we know now. And while the science is not always, especially as you read older science fiction, we've learned more. We might have learned more about technology, and it could couldn't happen in the way that we extrapolated it originally. But it's based on there's different. Some people say that Star Trek, you can't, there's no way to have the transportation is not based on the transporter is probably not based on some scientific fact that you could extrapolate, but it's still based on the idea of science expanding rather than a magical being in the world or some fantastical element or some myth. Even something like if you look at Wonder Woman in the new movies now, and she's more fantastical and magical, whereas you have somebody like Captain America, which is from a different world, and he was the result of a scientific experiment. So it's kind of interesting you can have difference. So again, there often are overlaps between the two, and there's something called science fantasy, which I think I'll talk about a little bit, but it is kind of often people either like fantasy because they like the fantasy elements and the kind of made up thing, or they like science fiction. Some the people tend to go towards one or the other, although I love both. This happens to be speculative fiction happens to be one of my very favorite genres, and I like both fantasy and science fiction, and have read it for my whole lifetime. So it's very fun. One of the really interesting things, particularly about science fiction, although it also happens in fantasy, is because you're able to construct this world, do this world building, you can often talk about what's going on in the real world. For example, going back to Star Trek, if you remember if you were a Star Trek fan, and even if you weren't, I'm sure that you remember or know that the original Star Trek had, for its time, considering it came out in the early 60s sometime, and had a African American woman on the bridge. I think the original pilot actually had a woman as second in command. You had often what they were looking at. They had one episode where there was a race of people fighting, and they were fighting because they were had a line down their face, down their whole body. Half of it was white, half was black. But the one side had white on the right and one side had white on the left, and so they couldn't get along with each other. So these are all comments on what's going on in the real world. And there was a time, if you think about during the 60s, 50s and 60s, after the first atom bomb and hydrogen bomb were created and used, you had a lot of movies and books about things that were, because of the radio activity, were made gigantic. You had, I think it's called Them, you had gigantic ants that overtook, that were attacking everybody. And even a lot of the alien stories at that time were based on fears of being invaded. The Cold War had influence, and the stories were about the Cold War and about fears of what this radioactivity that we've loosed on the world would do. And it showed itself in various ways, often larger insects. And I think there was aliens were really big in the 50s and 60s also. So, and another kind of underlying current that you find in a lot of speculative fiction is very much a good versus evil that you won't necessarily find in don't always find or find as much in realistic fiction. It's a kind of a way of exploring good versus evil in very concrete terms. So what I'm going to do is, as I've done with other lectures, introduce you to various categories or subgenres within fantasy and then within science fiction. And these are based on categories in a book by Susan Fichtelberg, who's a librarian in New Jersey. She wrote a book called Encountering Enchantment, and I found her listing of subgenres to be useful. So we're going to go through it. And as you will see, these genres blend and overlap, but it's just a way of, it can be a good way of finding out what a student might want to read, when you're trying to do reader's advisory, kind of getting a feel for what parts of the book they like. And it might be that they want to read about wizards, or it might be that they really liked reading about gods. Could be another element of the book that really made them enjoy it, but this is one way of finding ways of recommending and going on, helping students find the next book that they want to read. So wizardry is big, has been big since Harry Potter came out, is still big now. Harry Potter is the most obvious way, the most known one at this point. But there's some other really good, we did a lot when Harry Potter was first coming out, a lot of if you liked, then read, and trying to find other wizard books and books about magic in kind of British schools and that sort of thing. Some of the ones that we looked at then, Diane Wynne Jones does this Chrestomancy Chronicles, and it's about wizards, the stories of wizards set in parallel universes, which parallel universes are a whole another segment, but we're focusing on the wizard part of this Chrestomancy Chronicles because they have to do with wizardry in various universes, and sometimes they cross over and stories go on. I've read a couple of pieces of these, and they're a lot of fun. Probably, I want to say probably middle grade. Diane Duane, the So You Want to Be a Wizard, is a fun book. Oops, my mouse is very touchy. These two kids find a book that gives them instructions for being a wizard, and they start following instructions, and adventures ensue. Epic fantasy takes us back. Lord of the Rings is the classic epic quest fantasy with world-changing high fantasy themes throughout it, and that's really why YA and adult. A lot of people first read it in their teen years and then reread it later on. The Lord of the Rings as its classic, and of course the movies that came out made people more interested. It's interesting because a lot of times The Hobbit will be listed for younger kids, not as, I mean, younger teens, and then Lord of the Rings for teens to adult. If you're looking for something younger that's also kind of an epic kind of world-changing fantasy, Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. Le Guin is a classic writer in fantasy and science fiction, and this it started out as a trilogy, The Wizard of Earthsea, and then it went on to be 6 books, and it's the story of Jed, who's a sorcerer. What's interesting about this is it's a non-white main character, which they made a movie or a TV movie of this and whitewashed the character and chose a white actor for it, which I think Le Guin had no control over, and there was a lot of controversy over, so it's really interesting. But it's definitely can be read by middle grade, but it's still got that kind of epic feel that you get from Lord of the Rings. Also could be classified as wizardry because wizardry and sorcery are very closely related. There's probably some language that separates the two, sorcery and wizardry, but they're very closely related. Myths and legends, we talked about them under traditional literature, but they can also be considered fantasy because it's about things that can't happen in the realistic world as we understand it. So Percy Jackson and the Olympians, Rick Riordan, and he's also got the Greek gods now, I think, and it's a very popular series. So that's a lot of a good book, a good series of books. It's nice when you can find a series that what you can continue giving to kids when they get excited and they want to read more. So The Lightning Thief, I think, was the first in Percy Jackson and the Olympians, and he went on to write more of those books. And like I said, I think he went on to do another series of gods, which is escaping me right now. Sea of Trolls by Nancy Farmer. This one's interesting because it's based on Nordic myths and legends. So in this book, the main character, a boy, and his sister are stolen during a raid in England, in a Viking raid, and when they are taken back to the Nordic country where they're from, they actually encounter some of the myths in real life. I like Nancy Farmer's work. And of course, fairy tales, we talked about that also when we talked about traditional literature, but it absolutely can be considered fantasy because it has fantastical elements. There was a series when Just Ella and Robin McKinley came out where they were retelling fairy tales, and actually I've been seeing it again now. Just Ella was Margaret Peterson Haddock's, and I like this one because Prince Charming was not so charming, and she realized that it's a strong female character, which is nice. A lot of these retellings of the fairy tales tend to have the female character be stronger and not as not like that Disney compilation that I showed you where the message is, surrender to whoever, to the male. Here there's a strong female character who makes her own decisions and has agency in her life. Spindle's End is Robin McKinley and is a retelling of the Sleeping Beauty tale, and this is more YA and very interesting. I've also seen recently stories with Russian folk tales. There's one called I think it's called Vasa in the Night, which has elements of Baba Yaga, which is a Russian, and Vasilia the Beautiful, I think, is a Russian fairy tale, but it takes place in modern Brooklyn. There's one by Gregory Maguire, who wrote Wicked, that's called The Egg and Spoon, that takes place in Russia, but it's Baba Yaga and also kind of a Prince and Pauper mashup. So it's interesting. So I've seen there was a big time with retelling, then it seemed to fade away, and I see it coming back. But with fairy tale, I've seen more folk and fairy tales that I hadn't that are more unusual that I haven't seen in. It's rather than Cinderella, you get things. There's also it's kind of a retelling of some of the classic Cinderella is Cinder, and it's in science fiction. So it's just been interesting to see over time trends. Oh, here's parallel, alternate and parallel worlds. I talked about Crestomancy, parallel worlds. Alternate is usually when something changes in history to change the, the way things turned out. So you'll have the Civil War turn out differently, or most often it's, Hitler won, and so it becomes an alternate universe. And parallel worlds are, or it can be something that's seems to be like our world with the alternate and parallel worlds, but there's just something a little bit different. One of the Crestomancy uses parallel worlds where it's things are just slightly different, and there's multiple parallel worlds in Philip Pullman's trilogy, which is just totally escaping my brain now. But his trilogy, that was the first one, was made into a movie. So and their things are slightly different on each world. Sometimes it's just one world where there's something different. James and the Giant Peach, The Thief Lord by Cornelia Funke. It takes place in Venice. Orphan brothers move to Venice, or wind up in Venice, and things seem to be going along in a realistic fiction sort of way. And then there's a magical element goes into it. There's a merry-go-round that's magical. It's almost kind of a magical realism in The Thief Lord. Somebody kind of got annoyed. Golden Compass. I have it right there. I'm blah blah blahing here, and Golden Compass is the one I was talking about with parallel worlds. If I just looked at my slides, I would be able to remember. Lost Kingdom is one I read where there was a technology that allowed it's more like steampunk, which I'll go into, but there was technology that allowed them to explore farther into the United States at an earlier time. So Ben Franklin was able to send a group of people out on a balloon reconnaissance before that would have been possible. And Chronicles of Narnia have parallel worlds. You have, they go through the wardrobe to get into another world. Another subgenre is the fairy realm, which often overlaps with urban fantasy. You can have the fairy realm, which is fairies as opposed to fairy tales, Fairy. Fairy realm is usually darker, and they're, if you are trapped under, if you go into the fairy world, you get trapped in there, and it's just not a good thing. They tend to be ignoring other people. They don't treat humans well. So there's this darkness, and it often takes place in urban areas. So it can be an urban fantasy without going into the fairy realm. Tithe by Holly Black, which is YA, really does this, combines the two. It starts in actually urban New Jersey, and then goes into the fairy realm. She meets people from the fairy realm, fairies from the fairy realm. It's interesting. Tithe was Holly Black. She's become very popular fantasy writer, and she was taking a YA class, and I was in the class with her in Rutgers when Tithe was accepted as it was her first published book. So she was coming into the class telling us that it had been accepted and it was going to be published, and now she does a ton of books with, she does the Spiderwick Chronicles with Dieter Lisi, and she's also done, she mostly sticks with this urban modern fantasy concept. Guardian of the Dead, this was an interesting book because it takes place in New Zealand and it's Maori legends, so it was, to me, very interesting to have those legends. So it really could go back into myths and legends, but it takes place in the current urban world. So see, again, crossover. These are not neat categories, but just ways of thinking of things. Shadow Shaper is a relatively new book by Daniel Jose Older, and I really like this one because it takes place in Brooklyn. Sierra Santiago is a Puerto Rican descendant of Puerto Ricans, immigrants, and she's a very strong female character, and she discovers magic that infuses ancestral spirits into art, such as paintings. She's doing murals, and the murals start crying, paintings, music, and stories. So very well written, very interesting. Fantasy romance is a genre that really talks about relationships, and romance is central to the plot. In Princess Academy, it's Shannon Hale doesn't do girly romances, but I don't want to say that negatively, but the plot is about a relationship. There is the fantasy element. It takes place kind of in a kingdom where the prince was told the prince was told he would find his bride at this place. So they go to this princess academy to learn how to be princesses, and one of them is supposed to be the next princess, but they have mind speech, which is kind of like telepathy, and they can talk back and forth, and also I think through the rocks in the ground. It's been a while since I read it, but again, the element of fantasy is important in here. Fantasy mystery, again, it's a mystery novel, but with fantastic elements. Thursday Next series is really an adult series that tends to be, it's about books that actually come alive. So they're solving mysteries about classic novels or within classic novels. Never Trust a Dead Man. Vivian Van Velde writes some funny stuff, and this is a story of it's like in medieval Europe, and this young man is accused of killing somebody, and so his punishment is to put him in the same cave where they're burying the person he was supposed to have killed. And a witch comes along and saves him, and in order to solve who actually killed it, she brings the person who was killed back to life as a bat, I think. And it sounds very weird, but she manages to make it very funny, and very poignant. I really like her work. And The Fifth Elephant by Terry Pratchett, that's more adult, YA adult, and it's a mystery Terry Pratchett does the Discworld, which is a world that is it's a disc that's on the back of a turtle, which is on 4 elephants, and there's all these fantastical elements in it. Creatures, Fabulous Beasts, and Talking Animals. We talked about beast stories in picture books, and there's also quite a few in fantasy. Talking Animals is really a fantastical thing. In any picture book where you have a talking animal, you're really talking about fantasy, because in the realistic world we don't understand what animals say, and they don't speak English and walk on their hind legs. So dragons, unicorns, talking animals. Tale of Despero by Kate DiCamilla is a mouse living in a castle. Inheritance series by Christopher Paolini. This was written, I included this one. It's some people love it, some people hate it. This kid evidently started it when he was a teenager and wrote 3 or 4 books, I don't remember, and it was made into a really bad movie. But again, the beasts are magical. They don't have to all be talking, but they're dragons in this case, and so in this case they're magical dragons. There can be dragons. Most of the time dragons are magical. There can be instances of Dragon Riders of Pern is an older series, and basically those are scientifically engineered dragons because they were bred from a species of lizard with wings that were on the planet. Earth colonists came to the planet, and they needed to in order to defend themselves, they needed to breed these dragons. So they bred a telepathic dragon who was able to fly. That's science fiction. That's not fantasy because the reason behind it was scientific. It wasn't a magical dragon or a creature that doesn't exist in real life that didn't have a scientific reason for being alive. Um, Prelude the Bold. This is a book that's been around for a while by Avi. It's a Newbery Medal winner, and I really like this. Perlu is a rabbit-like creature. He's called a Montmer. He's summoned by the leader of his people, the Montmers, who makes him the heir to the crown. While Perlu prefers to read history, events make him a leader. And I really like that book. Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim, that's an older book. Highly intelligent rats from a lab help the widowed Mrs. Frisby. And actually, I really should have this under science fiction because they're speaking because of the experiments that they've been experimented on. So I have this in the wrong place. I have it under here because it's talking animals. The Redwall series by Brian Jakes is a series, various animals in a medieval setting. Jakes does an especially good job describing feasts. For some reason, he spends a lot of time describing that they go off to battle and then they'll come back and have feasts, or they're preparing the wall, preparing defensives, but they also have to have a feast. And there's actually a book separate from this, and this is a long series called The Feasts of Redwall, it's an illustrated fiction book and has descriptions of a lot of the feasts that he's talked about in the books. Charlotte's Web, of course, is a classic talking animal book, fantasy, because the spider talks and the Wilbur talks, so it's basically fantasy. Seraphina is another dragon book. Obviously, I'm fascinated by dragon books. But it's interesting because there's dragons and people, and dragons are kind of Vulcan-like, non-emotional, and there's a treaty between dragons and humans, and Seraphina, the title character, is actually both, she's both dragon and human, and so she is in the middle of this war between and tentative peace between the dragons and the humans. Time travel is another area that can be science fiction or fantasy. It depends on how it's explained. For example, Time Warp Trio, it's an older series, but it's John Sheska, and it's a good early chapter book, but the time travel takes place because of a time warping book. Magic Treehouse, it's Magic Treehouse, and that's what allows them to go back and forth in time. Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen is an interesting book because during Passover in the modern times, the main character suddenly is thrown back in time to 1942 Poland during the Holocaust. So there's no scientific reason for her to go back in time. So it's a magical or fantastical happening. Paranormal and horror, ghosts, vampires, werewolves, etc., and comes under fantasy. Can kind of, vampires and werewolves could be beasts, talking beasts too, but it really is its own paranormal and horror. And vampires, as we know, if you were following children's literature with Team Edward and Team Twilight, that whole series, and it inspired a bunch of different vampire stories. And actually, vampires, Dracula is an early fantasy horror that is a foundation of the fantasy horror subgenre, and that goes back quite a ways, and we continue to see it come back in waves. So Bunnicula is kind of a funny rabbit tale of a mystery. These are kind of older books by Jane Howe, but they're for the younger reader, not like a middle chapter book, and they're kind of fun books. Cirque du Freak was a little older, higher upper middle grades to YA, and it's a conceit where Darren Shan writes about a character named Darren Shan who becomes a vampire's assistant to save his best friend. And so it's kind of a funny meta sort of book. The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. This was wonderful. I listened to this one on audiobook, and Neil Gaiman read it. And everyone in Nobody Owen's family is killed, but he escapes. He's a baby, and he escapes by going down the stairs and crawling out the front door of his house, and is raised by the residents of a nearby graveyard. Being England, some of the residents have been dead for quite a while, a couple hundred years. Some of them are quite old, and it's his story of how he was raised. The beginning chapter is a little gruesome, but the rest of it is really interesting, and for older middle. I know Coraline is another one of his that I haven't read, but very, very popular. Goosebumps series, second, third grade, of course, horror, well loved. I think they're coming back again. My son, he's in his 30s now, he loved these books and read them like nobody's business. This is a newer book, Girl from the Well by Rin Chupeco. This one just really got me. A centuries-old ghost from Japan who can see the ghosts surrounding adults who have killed children and deals with the killer savagely, begins to haunt a troubled teen boy. And it's just really compelling. I really liked it. Not as scary as that summary sounds, but really fascinating. The Demon Notebook is 5 girls. This is a little bit younger book, older middle school. 5 girls have tried and failed to cast a series of spells, but suddenly the spells begin to take effect one at a time, wreaking havoc on their school, and they're taking effect. They kept trying worse and more and more damaging spells, and the spells are coming in the order that they tried them in, and they need to stop it before somebody really gets hurt. Okay, science fiction. As I said, science fiction is basically based on some kind of scientific explanation, some extrapolation of science into the future. And it can be the very near future, or it can be future. So basically, adventure. This is an old book. Have space suit, will travel. It actually is. It holds up well. It's by Robert Heinlein, who is a stranger in a strange land, and the main character in this, Kip Russell, wins an authentic spacesuit, tries it on, and winds up rescuing a captured little girl from space aliens. I wouldn't blanket recommend Robert Heinlein to, anyone. A lot of his books aren't available anymore, but this one is just a really cute old adventure one. Time travel. In here, the time travel is taking place scientifically. In Singing the Dog Star Blues, Joss is a student of time travel at the Center for Neo-Historical Studies, and she has to travel back in time to change history to save her roommate, Mavkel. And basically, there is a scientific way. It's kind of like H.G. Wells, where the guy makes the machine to go back in time. That's science fiction, as opposed to just magically being able to go through time. Aliens, of course, are a classic part of science fiction. Have space or travel involves aliens. Interstellar Pig by William Slater is a role-playing game. The character is on vacation. He finds a role-playing game and starts playing it with his neighbors, but is it only a game? Ender's Game is a classic. Orson Scott Card. This is one of those issues of, the author's not so great, but the work is pretty interesting. But basically, Ender Wiggins is an 8-year-old genius trained in battle school to fight against aliens that have attacked Earth once before, and are attacking again. And it goes on to a series of books that get less and less interesting as it goes on. Ender's Game is like the first one and the best one. Experimental science is an interesting subsection of science fiction. In House of Scorpion, again by Nancy Farmer, a drug lord uses clones. He lives in um, a land cut out between the borders of Mexico and the United States. And this drug lord uses clones as organ donors to keep himself alive. And the latest clone finds out he's a clone and tries to escape his fate as the next donor. The Adoration of Jenna Fox by Mary Pearson is interesting because a teen wakes up from a coma after an accident and struggles with the implications of medical advances that saved her life. So it's an interesting one. If you're looking for a bioethical discussion, that would be an interesting one to include. And a lot of the science fiction ones could be connected with ethics or science or history, even with time travel, or there's ways to think of aliens. When you think of that, we call immigrants aliens. There's an issue of how the other, and the unknown, and somebody new coming in to what we know, that can be talked about in terms of aliens. Cyberpunk is high tech, low life, gritty, has to do with cyberspace, virtual reality, cybernetics, misuse of technology, and a breakdown of social order. Neuromancer is the classic, it's the seminal book in cyberpunk, but you can also think about Blade Runner, which is the movie that was loosely based on Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which I think is like the greatest title ever. Ready Player One is an Ernest Cline book that is now coming out as a movie, which is also can be thought of as cyberpunk. It's interesting because the book takes place in the future, but it has a lot to do with gaming, and the gaming has a lot to do with the 80s. So even though it takes place in the future, all of the references are to things that were popular in the 80s. So it's kind of an interesting back and forth. But the technology has kind of broken down, there's virtual reality, and society is broken down, but technology has gone forward. So it's kind of interesting. Steampunk is a fun combination of Victorian era aesthetic and new technologies. If you think about Wild Wild West with Denzel Washington, if you remember seeing that one, it's this corsets and technology together, is a way to think of it. Leviathan is an alternate World War I scenario where the British were Darwinists and create an airship based on whale DNA, while the opposition, the Germans, are known as clankers, and they use steam-driven machines. Bone Shaker is another one where you have these steam. It's called steampunk because the technology they use is often powered by steam. So it's kind of an interesting combination. That if you look up steampunk costumes, it's so interesting to see that you're kind of playing with the Victorian era classic dress up, and how technology inserted into that would have affected that era. Future societies, often dystopian, and dystopia has been huge. Hunger Games is dystopian. Divergent is dystopian. Feed, I just love this book. It has a lot of cursing in it, but it's so interesting. A society where everyone has a direct feed, basically a computer chip in their heads, and they can chat with each other through the feed, and ads are pushed through the feed. They describe like walking through a mall and seeing an ads like you just see ads, they're pushed. It's kind of basically the internet, but in your head. And everything's going along until a hacker disrupts their feeds and leaves these teens adrift. And really, I think well written. Again, it's saying something by setting it in the future. It's saying something about right now. It's a commentary on what we're facing right now. And as the internet becomes more and more, and phones become more and more part of kids' lives, this just takes it one step further and talks about what happens when we don't have it. Another dystopian series is the Shadow Children series, where and there is the main character is an illegal third child. They're only allowed to have two children, and they have to hide their third children. Science fantasy is not hard science extrapolations. Sometimes Wrinkle in Time, I think partly because it was very early, is included in this because it was, there's some hard science in it, but it's more fantastical than science. It's still science fiction. And the movie's out now. And I just like to mention this one because you don't find science fiction in picture books very often, but this one is John Sheska and David Shannon, and it's a 3-inch tall robot who wants to conquer the world. He lands in a suburban kitchen and battles blenders, toasters, and televisions. So I thought that was cute. So why fantasy and science fiction? It really provides an additional flexibility of imagination. Not that you don't have imagination if you don't like science fiction and fantasy, but it's a different kind of imagination to go beyond what is realistic. And it raises important questions to consider and connects to current topics. And it's just a wonderful exploration of what if. And as usual, when I just really love a genre, you get a long lecture. So I apologize for that, and I'll see you on the discussion boards.